Good evening and a warm welcome to our fifth Eclipse webinar. My name is Marta Jackowska. I work at SWPS University in Poland, which is a co-organizer of Eclipse webinars. Today, we will have a great pleasure to listen to a keynote lecture given by Professor Rory O'Connor from the University of Glasgow. Professor O'Connor is a health psychologist and one of leading world and definitely European experts on suicide and self-harm. I also wish to welcome members of our panel discussion, which will take place after Rory's talk, where we will be joined by Professors Corey Newman from University of Pennsylvania, Tobias Staisman from University of Bochum, Danute Gailiene from Vilnius University in Lithuania. All of our panelists are clinical psychologists and or therapists with expertise in suicide. Last but not least, I wish to thank the audience for joining us live tonight. Please use the chat function to ask questions that I can pose to members of the panel or to Rory O'Connor. So once again, warm welcome. Thank you for joining us. And now over to you, Rory.
Great. Thanks, Marta. Can I just confirm that you can hear me okay and see my slides?
I can hear you really okay.
Brilliant. Excellent. Okay, over the next 30 minutes or so, I'm going to talk about some of the work that we've been doing here in Glasgow, probably spanning, some of the work spans at least 20 years. And really what it's at the heart of is really the work that we've been doing in terms of understanding suicide risk. And then towards the end of the presentation, I'll talk about some of the work we've been doing on interventions-based work, such as safety planning. It's worth acknowledging the range of funders that support our work and without whom our work would not be possible. And that includes both standard public health or government type sponsors and research councils, as well as those who've been bereaved by suicide who have then keen to fund research to prevent the absolute devastation of suicide. And so where that brings me then to is the scale of the challenge we face in suicide prevention. There are different ways in which we can describe that scale. If we look at the World Health Organization statistics, we know that at least 703,000 people die by suicide each year. Or there's another way in which we can describe the scale of the challenge. And that is here, again, another World Health Organization statistic, is that 1 in every 100 deaths globally is by suicide. So if we then contextualize that in terms of other causes of death, so that's more people die by suicide than the combined number of deaths from HIV, from malaria, breast cancer, war, and homicide. Now that is not to downplay the significance of those causes of death, but certainly as somebody who's been working in this field for many years, I find it horrifying that suicide prevention does not receive the public health focus that it requires. Now that is changing in a good way in recent years, but it's still, we're not receiving the focus that we should do compared to, say, other causes of death which are physical in origin. Now, when we think about suicide and suicide prevention, then we have to recognize the complexity. Is that suicide is rarely caused by a single factor, and indeed, it's really important when we think about suicide and suicide prevention that we recognize the vast range or domains of suicide risk factors. And here's a framework we published before the pandemic in 2019. It's just an overarching biopsychosocial model of suicide risk. And I'm just really highlighting that for a couple of reasons. First of all, to highlight the complexity, the recognition that yes, suicide is genuinely the result of a biopsychosocial phenomenon. To understand and prevent suicide takes more than simply the treatment of mental illness. And of course, the treatment of mental illness is important, but it's only one small part of the puzzle of suicide prevention. And this slide also recognizes the importance of recognizing the social context in which suicide risk evolves. And social context incorporates cultural factors, as well as your immediate environment, as well as the sort of the broader societal factors. And then I also think it's important that we recognize suicide from a developmental perspective, especially as psychologists, we recognize the importance of that. And I'll touch on some of the sort of early life adversity or early life trauma work that we've done in a few slides' time. But really, we highlight here, we know that obviously in the antecedents of many mental health problems, but in particular, the antecedents of suicide, often early life trauma plays a role. And of course, then at the heart of, if you move through the developmental factors into the proximal factors, of course, we know that in most Western countries, that the majority of suicides occur in the context of mental illness. So psychopathology here is an important proximal factor. But as I've said already, it's important to look beyond mental illness. And indeed, the reason I often say that is because if we look at the statistics around the relationship between mental health problems and suicide risk, yes, indeed, some of the statistics suggest that upwards of 80 to 90% of people who die by suicide have a mental health problem at the time of death. So that's an important relationship. But if you flip the relationship round and ask yourself, what percentage of people who are treated for depression end their lives? It's about 4 or 5%. So in reality then, if we're then, for me, the work that I've been doing over the last 20 years is trying to better understand what is it about the 4 or 5% of people, say, who've got depression, who take their own lives, how are they similar and different from the 96 or 95% of people who also are treated for depression who don't take their lives? And I think that differentiation between the 4% and the 96% helps us recognize that we need to look beyond one single risk factor for suicide, but we need to look beyond mental health problems specifically. And recognize that suicide ultimately is a public health concern. And for us to tackle suicide prevention effectively, we need to address it as a public health problem. Now, but what I'm going to then focus in on, though, for much of the talk over the next few minutes is this box here. So the work that we've been doing really argues that suicide is usually not about wanting to die, but rather wanting mental pain to end. And in the next slide, I'll highlight a model of suicide, the IMV model that I've developed, which helps us try to make sense of that mental pain. And the argument is that, yes, there's dysregulated mood, which, yes, is associated with a sort of global or a sort of a more global sense of pessimism for the future or hopelessness. But what's crucial, though, is this sense of being trapped by that mental pain. And that ultimately suicide is that the permanent solution, as Edwin Schneidman, one of the founding fathers of suicide research and suicide prevention, described it many years ago. Suicide is a permanent solution to often temporary problems. So my argument will be, for us to understand suicide and its prevention, we have to understand the emergence of a particular type of mental pain, the sense of entrapment. And it's that sense of entrapment which is the key substrate to the emergence of suicidal thinking. So that sets up nicely then the focus on my model, the integrated motivational volitional model. Because as you'll see, at the heart of the model is this sense of entrapment. But the model is more than that. So for the purposes of today, I'll just give you some key messages or key principles that underpin the model. So the IMV model is in 3 parts. On the left-hand side, we've got the pre-motivational phase, which is a background context in which suicidal risk may emerge. And it includes things like vulnerability factors, diatheses factors, or it includes environmental factors and negative life events. Because we know that in almost every country in the world, there's a really steep socioeconomic gradient associated with suicide. So for example, in Western countries, you're usually about 3 times more likely to die by suicide if you're from a more socially disadvantaged background compared to a more affluent background. And we also know that negative life events play a key role, and that people who die by suicide tend to have experienced a disproportionate number of negative life events compared to those who don't die by suicide. So that social context is vital. And indeed, we often describe it in the work that we do, is to understand suicide risk, is to understand the person within their social context. And I don't think we've done enough historically to look at that interplay between, in this case, psychological factors and social and cultural factors. Now, at the heart of the model, though, is parts 2, the middle bit, which is the motivational phase, and part 3 on the right-hand bit, which is the volitional phase. Now, the motivational phase is really trying to understand the emergence of suicidal thinking. And in essence, in a very parsimonious way, the argument is that suicidal thoughts or suicidal ideation is more likely to emerge in individuals who feel defeated, and or humiliated, from which they cannot escape. And that sense of entrapment is key. Now, of course, feelings of defeat and humiliation can be triggered by a range of other factors like rejection, like loss, and like shame. But the key premise of the IMV model, though, is that if we're to understand the emergence of suicidal thinking, it is the co-presence of defeat and humiliation from which you feel trapped, which is a key driver to the emergence of those thoughts. And then the last bit of the model on the right-hand side is the volitional phase, and it's trying to understand this transition from thinking about suicide to acting on your thoughts of suicide. And again, the best evidence suggests that about 30% of people who have thoughts of suicide cross the precipice from thinking to acting. And in essence, really then the volitional phase is trying to understand who's more likely to cross that precipice. And according to my model, there are 8 key factors, the volitional factors or the volitional moderators, which I'll return to in a couple of slides' time, which help us to understand that transition. So then just to have a brief summary then. So the model in essence argues that defeat and entrapment are key to the emergence of suicidal thinking, but the factors that govern the transition from suicidal thoughts to suicidal acts are different. That transition is governed by a group of factors called the volitional factors. As I say, I'll return to those in a couple of slides' time. And research that we and others have done involving thousands of patients and non-clinical samples have shown the central importance of defeat and humiliation and entrapment in this suicidal process. So an obvious question is, well, how do we go about assessing entrapment? And we tend to use historically a 16-item scale called the entrapment scale. And that's the entrapment scale which was developed by Paul Gilbert in the late 1990s. But then more recently, indeed during COVID, we published a brief version of the entrapment scale. And here are the 4 questions that we now use in our studies to assess entrapment. Questions 3 and 4, they tap internal entrapment, that idea of being trapped inside your mind, that mental pain, I feel trapped inside myself. And then items 1 and 2 are assessing external entrapment, like I feel powerless to change things. So and again, what we find is when we assess people using this scale, people's response on this scale can predict suicidality, suicidal thinking, and behavior over time. So clinically, my argument is we should be, if we're in a clinical context, we should always be routinely assessing entrapment because we know it comes in waves of intensity. Okay, so that's all I'm going to say about entrapment and the emergence of suicidal thoughts at this stage. What I'm going to move on to now is thinking about this transition, this crossing the precipice from suicidal thoughts to suicidal acts. And during the pandemic in 2021, I wrote the book, When It's Darkest, during the pandemic. It was my attempt at synthesizing both my personal experiences as well as my professional experiences over the last 20 or so years. And in the book, I talk about various people I meet or I've met on my journey in terms of suicide prevention. And here's a heartbreaking quote from a mother who lost her son to suicide. "I never thought he'd do it. A few weeks before his death, he had told me that he had thoughts about being dead, but I was too scared to ask him directly whether he would kill himself. I haven't stopped asking myself why I didn't ask him. Not a day passes when I don't torment myself with this question. When I look back on now, I just didn't think he's the type of person who would kill himself. I know how ridiculous that sounds, but he was just always so full of life." Heartbreaking. And it's heartbreaking because it illustrates that for so many of us who've been bereaved by suicide, and I speak as somebody who's lost two important people in my life to suicide, is we often ask ourselves the question, what could we have done differently? But as we know, all of us who work in the field of suicide prevention, we know that it's our ability to predict who will die by suicide sadly remains no better than chance, but there have been advances made in helping us understand who is more likely to act on their thoughts of suicide. Indeed, that brings me back to my IMV model. And if you think back to the third part of my model, that right-hand bit, the volitional phase, that's my attempt to understand that transition from suicidal thinking to suicidal acts. And all I've done with this slide is I've blown up the third part of my model, the volitional phase, to make it hopefully easier to understand. So in essence, what we've got here is people who have suicidal thinking on that left-hand bar, and then on the right-hand bar, we've got people who act on their thoughts, engage in suicidal behavior. And then the 8 boxes in the middle outline the 8 volitional phase factors, which I argue the presence of these increases the likelihood you cross the precipice from suicidal thoughts to suicidal acts. And many of them are intuitive. So the first one, having access to the means of suicide. It stands to reason that if you have thoughts of suicide and you've ready access to the means of suicide, you're more likely to act on your thoughts and cross the precipice. Exposure, the third one, because we know that knowing somebody who's died by suicide increases our own risk of suicide. It's as if it potentially legitimizes the behavior for us, or perhaps acts as a model for us. And so, again, it stands to reason that if you're having suicidal thoughts and you know somebody who dies by suicide, that increases the likelihood that you may act. It maybe increases the cognitive accessibility of suicide as a potential outcome for you. Now, it's important to put that in context. The overwhelming majority of people who are bereaved by suicide or who are exposed to the suicide of someone else will never become suicidal and will never die by suicide. And there's a couple of others just before I move on. So fearlessness about dying and death, this third last one. So again, the idea is if you're having suicidal thoughts, you have to overcome the fear instinct, the fear of death. You have to overcome the life instinct to cross the precipice from suicidal thoughts to suicidal acts. And then the last couple here, again, there's growing evidence that if you're having thoughts of suicide, coupled with picturing yourself or visualizing yourself dying or dead, you're more likely to act on your thoughts. And the last one is no surprise to us as psychologists. The single best predictor of any future behavior is past behavior. And so that, again, is true of suicide in the same way it's true of any other behavior. In my mind, it's really important that we conceptualize suicide not simply as an epiphenomenon or a byproduct of mental illness, but rather as a behavior in its own right. And if it's a behavior, it's something that somebody does or engages in, it highlights the central role of psychology. And indeed, I would argue that although there are many complex set of factors associated with suicide, some of which I highlighted at the start of my presentation, ultimately, suicide is a psychological phenomenon because an individual makes a decision to end their life. Okay, so again, if we look at our evidence-based studies that we and others have done, have supported the important role of these volitional phase factors in differentiating people who think about suicide from those who act on their thoughts. So these volitional phase factors govern that transition to behavioral inaction. Okay, so that's all today about the model for the present purposes. What I want to do now is move on from sort of understanding to intervening or acting. And so, been quite encouraging over the last 20 years has been the growth and interest in studies which have tried to, psychosocial interventions which have tried to interrupt the transition from suicidal thoughts to suicidal attempts, or interventions which have tried to prevent people becoming suicidal in the first place. And again, before the pandemic, we published a review, and each of the interventions outlined here, both pharmacological and psychosocial, that there's growing evidence in at least one population at risk, that there's evidence of the efficacy of these interventions. And indeed, there's been particular growth, I would argue, in the psychosocial and the brief interventions domains in recent years. But what I want to just say a few words about today is safety planning, which is an intervention which I always conceptualize as crucially at the heart of trying to interrupt the transition from suicidal thoughts to suicidal acts. The safety planning is widely used, and it was developed by Barbara Stanley and Greg Brown in the United States. And it grew out of the work that they did with veterans in the United States. So those of you who are less familiar with safety planning, it's a very simple, brief intervention which has 6 steps. In step 1, you work collaboratively with the individual who is suicidal, and collaboration and co-creation are absolutely central to the administration of safety planning. But you help somebody identify the warning signs that a suicidal crisis might be developing. And then steps 2, 3, 4, and 5 are about identifying individuals, organizations, or places that you can contact, either to distract you from an escalating suicidal crisis, or people you can talk to if you're concerned you cannot keep yourself safe. And then step 6, entitled here, Making the Environment Safe, is again working collaboratively with an individual to hopefully agree that if they've decided on a particular method of suicide, that you work collaboratively to increase the distance, both psychologically and environmentally, between the individual and that method of suicide. And so in essence, really, then what the safety plan is trying to do is recognize that we've got suicidal thoughts, and we know that suicidal thoughts have this natural arc. They increase in intensity, so they wax and wane, and then they resolve or recede. And what you're trying to do with a safety plan is hope that an individual who's having suicidal thoughts, if they've got a safety plan, that there's that natural resolution of the suicidal thinking without a suicidal act. You don't want the individual who have suicidal thoughts for those to continue to escalate and lead to a suicidal act. Now, again, during the pandemic, with colleagues across Europe, Belgium, and the Netherlands, we published a review of a meta-analysis of the evidence for safety planning type interventions. So this is looking at safety planning or any intervention which had a safety planning component. So it's pretty heterogeneous. But the really encouraging news was there was clear evidence that safety planning in its different forms seems to be associated with a reduction in suicide attempts and suicidal thoughts over time. And so again, around the same time as this, and maybe a couple of years before, we started our own feasibility trial, working closely with Barbara and Greg, and trying to see, could we administer safety planning in a National Health Service context, but not just safety planning on its own, safety planning with follow-up telephone support, in particular in individuals who had attempted suicide and had been admitted to the emergency department. Because, again, if you look at the evidence, the pre-existing evidence for safety planning, most of it has grown out of veteran populations in the United States and elsewhere. So this is a civilian population of individuals in our communities in Scotland. And although this is only a feasibility trial, the findings are really encouraging. So, as I said already, these are people who attempted suicide, admitted to the emergency department, and then they're discharged thereafter. So in our intervention, when we did the feasibility phase of it, those who are randomized to receive safety planning completed the safety planning with one of our team in hospital, and then they received weekly phone calls over the next 4 to 5 weeks. And that's a crucial period because we know risk of repetition of suicidal behavior is high at that period of time. And what's encouraging is in those follow-up phone calls, almost 82 or 81% of people discussed the content for safety planning during those phone calls, but also updated their safety plan. And it highlights the importance of recognizing that safety plans are dynamic documents. They're not documents set in stone. And then also particularly encouraging from a prevention point of view is that 6 in 10 of the intervention group completed the safety plan or said they completed the safety plan at least once and used it at least once in that 4 to 5 week period. Particularly important, as I say, because risk of suicide is high and suicidal behavior is high in those weeks following discharge from hospital. So all our progression criteria were met for that feasibility trial, and we're just trying to secure funding now for a full randomized clinical trial. But there's a couple of other studies ongoing which I want to direct your attention to. Working with colleagues across primarily the UK, but led by a colleague, Tony Morrison in England, we're conducting the RAPID trial. And one arm of the RAPID trial is with individuals with serious mental health problems. We've tailored the safety planning to be delivered remotely by telephone. And we're looking to see, will safety planning be effective in reducing hospitalization in the 6 months, again, following the completion of the safety plan. And then it's also like to draw your attention to one final study with regard to safety planning, again ongoing, which is led by colleague Jackie Rogers, again in England. But what we're trying to do here is another feasibility trial, but we're trying to tailor the safety plan for individuals who are autistic. Really important because although the evidence base suggests, yes, for some individuals, safety planning is effective, we need to take a much more tailored and personal medicine approach, in particular for people with characteristics which may impede their completion of the safety plan. And again, that project is going well and we'll have the findings pretty soon. Okay, in the last few minutes, excuse me, I want to just change tack slightly. It's related to the sort of broader suicide prevention field, but I want to tell you about a project that I've been involved in over the last 18 months. And the findings of this project were just published actually last week. And this is a sort of global collaborative project called Gone Too Soon. And what we were trying to do with this project was basically identify the risk factors associated with premature mortality from people who died by suicide, but also from people with mental illness more generally. And what we then did was we identified a group of 40 experts around the world from a whole range of different backgrounds. We did what's known as a road mapping exercise and a review of the literature. And we identified, first of all, 12 key factors which are important if we're going to tackle the prevention of premature mortality associated with mental illness and mental distress. But we also identified 18 actionable solutions which we think are important to help save lives. I'm just going to give you 2 or 3 slides on the risk factors. I'll say a couple of words about that. And then I'm just going to focus in on 3 of the solutions which I think are particularly important from a psychological perspective. So what was really noteworthy, this slide just summarizes the 12 overarching risk factors and mechanisms, which there was a lot of overlap about the risk factors and mechanisms associated with suicide and mortality from suicide. A lot of overlap with that and mortality with the comorbidities associated with mental illness. And all I just want to highlight is what's central to these mechanisms, a central role for our psychological processes and factors. And again, unsurprisingly, things like defeat, humiliation, entrapment, burdensomeness, feeling lonely and disconnected are important, as well as things on the left-hand side, like really understanding the stress response system, how the body responds to chronic stress, and so on. But what overpins all of it is taking a sort of structural inequalities lens and recognizing that again, death, premature mortality, both from mental illness and from suicide, is always socially patterned. So then in terms of the 18 solutions, as I said a second ago, I'm just going to say a couple of words about 3 of those solutions, and then I'll bring my presentation to an end. So the first one I just want to note, again, this came up time and time again in this road mapping exercise that we engaged in. It was a solution number 12. And it fits nicely with what I just said about safety planning. And although safety planning, there is a growing evidence base for its efficacy, we don't yet know who it works for. Who's it most effective for? Does it work for all individuals? Does it work for men versus women? People who are autistic versus those who are not? People from ethnic minorities? So again, one of our key solutions here was we need to, first of all, improve access to these effective treatments, but also they need to be personalized. And we need to better understand what the sort of mechanisms of action are. Why do they work? Because although there is growing evidence for the psychosocial interventions, in particular in the suicide field, often we don't know why they work. We don't know what the active ingredients are. And compassion has to be embedded in all aspects of that service provision and service delivery, and continuity of care to ensure that people who are discharged from hospital following a suicide attempt, for example, receive ongoing support if they need it, so they don't fall through the cracks. And then the second of the 3 solutions I'm mentioning from the Gone Too Soon project is, of course, perhaps unsurprisingly, we really need to harness our digital opportunities and big data, again, to help us better build effective personalized interventions. And although we've highlighted the importance of these digital opportunities in the paper, we also have a lot of caution exercised, because we know that the concern is that some of these interventions or risk factor modeling exercises can be associated with leading to discrimination in some groups and not others, because they're often modeled for the majority population and don't take into consideration the ethnic differences or other group differences. So although these are really exciting opportunities, we need to be careful. And the last of the sort of 3 from Gone Too Soon, and again, this hopefully brings us to where I began the presentation, talking about understanding an individual in their social and cultural context. And I think that what we highlight here is, yes, we need to better understand the interplay between biomarkers, but biomarkers in and of themselves, I don't think will really move forward or lead to a step change in suicide prevention unless we understand them in the context of an individual's lived experience. Okay, so that was a sort of a whistle-stop tour of some of the work that we've been doing right up until the most recent paper we just published last week. Where I want to just bring it all together then are what I describe as the 4 C's of suicide prevention. So it doesn't matter if you're talking about understanding or intervening or preventing more broadly. But we need to, as I've mentioned already, ensure that compassion is embedded throughout all our interventions, because too often people who are suicidal still are receiving care in which not only are they not receiving compassion, it's making matters worse, and they leave feeling more ashamed, a burden, and a waste of space. We have to embrace the second C of these 4 C's is recognizing the complexity of suicide prevention. But crucially, although we can recognize that complexity, frameworks like the IMV model help us make sense of that complexity. And again, psychology has a key role to play to that end. And then the last 2 C's is that there's different ways in which we think about connection. But we know, again, from all aspects of suicide prevention, anything that promotes a sense of social connectedness can be potentially life-saving. And then lastly, care. I think we need to think about different models of care. Our traditional models, for example, of going to a clinician and receiving your care and support, yeah, that might work for some, but for example, we don't know whether it works for men who are suicidal. So we need to rethink our models of care so that perhaps that we change it round, flip it on its head, and actually go to where men are, perhaps places like football clubs or rugby clubs or whatever it is, go to where men are and try and work and support men in that context. So we're looking at different models of care. So it's not a one size fits all. And then very lastly, what I try to highlight is, I think the human face of suicide prevention, it's just devastating. Behind every one of those statistics is a devastating loss. But each of us can do something, no matter how big or small, to promote a sense of connection, to promote a sense of compassion, and give much more person-centered care. And that can be in a clinical context, or it also can be in an individual one-on-one, friends, colleagues, family context. So please, I often end my talk by saying, if you are concerned about somebody who's suicidal, please reach out and ask them if they're okay. Because despite the myth, there is no evidence that asking somebody whether they're suicidal will plant the idea in their head. Rather, the evidence suggests that asking somebody whether they're suicidal could be the start of a life-saving conversation, which genuinely could save countless lives. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rory, for your talk. It's a hugely complicated issue, yet I feel that you've really explained it quite simply and at the same time quite elaborately. And it seems quite basic: compassion, care, continuity, right? I mean, this issue don't only apply to obviously suicide, just any mental health issue. So thank you very much. It was truly fascinating. Now we will have a short break. I have 2 good questions from the audience. I will pass those on. And after the break, each of the panelists will say a few minutes what their point of view is on the topic, and then we will have a joint discussion. So bear with us, and let's see after the break. Welcome after the break. Now we will have statements from each of our panelists, followed by a discussion, and then I've passed your questions to Rory, which will handle them after we have statements from our members of the panel. So if I could have Corey, please.
Sure thing, sure thing. Rory, thank you so much for your presentation, which is so important on so many levels. Let me start by saying that access to care is a very difficult goal to achieve. You are trying to do this in your work. It's wonderful. I have been very disconcerted by some statements made, even at the very highest levels from National Institutes of Mental Health in the US, up until recent years, that our treatments are failing. Looking at the rising rates of suicide, that a conclusion, or at least a hypothesis, was put there that our treatments are failing. And I don't believe that's true at all. I think our treatments, as typified by work such as Brown and Stanley and Brown, their safety planning, and many others in your own work, and Craig Bryan and so forth. The treatments are wonderful, but it's very difficult to present that to a large number of people. Follow-up is required, and your program is doing that. So I think that provides great hope for the future. I think also that life is becoming more difficult, and that's a general statement, but we have more existential threats, more fracturing of society, less support, and less compassion, as you're saying. So I think life is more difficult, access to care is more difficult, but the treatments themselves, I think, are promising. Safety planning, you're right, it's simple to do. It's simple to learn. Many practitioners can apply it. It can be done as a single intervention in an emergency department. It can be done as part of ongoing therapy. And of course, like any other portable treatment, it's not perfect. It needs to be individualized, as you've said. And certain parts of the treatment plan, we have caveats. So for example, the part that asks about early warning signs, that, of course, that's a very important variable, such as someone saying, yes, my early warning signs, I know I'm at risk maybe for depression, suicide, if I begin to isolate myself, if I stop communicating with people, if I give up doing the things I love to do, like I love to skate, I love to play guitar, and I stop doing it. This is an early warning sign. Very good, perfect, that's what it's meant for. But someone like Craig Bryan, in his brilliant recent book, Rethinking Suicide, makes a very compelling argument based on the data that some suicides are very impulsive. And it's difficult to ascertain an early warning sign when the suicidal behavior can be so impulsive. Now, what causes impulsive behavior? Well, one could argue that it's schema activation, if we speak in terms of schema therapy, the work of Arnold Arntz and Jeffrey Young, that people can be activated very quickly in abandonment schema. Someone doesn't get back to them, doesn't respond to their overture of friendship, and they feel alone and unlovable and abandoned, and they may try suicide, which is another reason why preventing access to lethal means is so important in preventing suicide, because when someone has easy access to lethal weapons or a stockpile of pills, medications, they can impulsively try suicide. We want to buy some time. That's another important part of the safety planning. When it's used properly, it helps the person buy some time so that the acute risk can go down and they can get some help from other people. And one more thing I can say is that with regard to the concept of entrapment, where someone feels helpless and hopeless, that their pain will never go away, they don't see any way out within the scope of life. They really truly believe that the only thing that will end the suffering is to end their lives. There's no other way. So first, with the notion of compassion, first for the clinician to be willing to acknowledge and validate the feeling. It's important to validate the feeling while also expressing the idea that we may not want to validate the belief behind the feeling. Everyone is entitled to their feelings. We will give compassion for those feelings, but maybe the idea that gave rise to the feeling needs to be reevaluated. This idea that there is no way out other than to die. And I will ask hypothetical questions. Let's say, for the sake of argument, if you could know, just use your imagination, someone could tell you that in 2 years' time, 2 years, you would emerge from this pain. You would once again go skating again, play your guitar again. You would once again speak to your friends, but it would be 2 years of suffering. But you knew that you would emerge in 2 years. Would you wait? Would you wait the 2 years? And many times people will say, yes, I would, but you cannot promise me it will happen in 2 years. You're right, I cannot. This is a hypothetical, but there will be no 2 years if you die. And I wonder if we can talk about building up your curiosity for what your life could be like in the future when you reemerge. Right now, it's impossible to imagine, but let's envision that. This is the opposite of people having the risk factor of envisioning their death. This is envision a reemergence into a less painful life. And it's a process. It's not something that even the best cognitive behavioral therapist will not convince this horribly in pain person that things will be fine in 2 years. It's not a matter of convincing. It's raising reasonable doubt about the idea that they'll never reemerge, they'll never recover. Let's consider the possibility. How will you get there? And once you're there, what will you do? So this is one example of trying to get over the entrapment aspect of suicide. And I'm very mindful of time, so I don't want to go any further, and we'll have more conversation. I'm just very, very enthused about this program that you've mentioned, Rory, because I think it will give much more access to care, reach more people, and we'll see our treatments are working quite well, even as we develop them further. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Could we have now Danuta, please?
Yeah. Thank you, Rory. Thank you so much for wonderful presentation. And we met in Vilnius sometimes, and our suicidologist collaborates with you very successfully. So I am very thankful to you. You have this broader view of suicidal problem. It's not only mental illness, it's biopsychosocial, and it's very important. And I would like to look at cultural aspect. So you mentioned, but it's really in suicidology is really very, very important, not just to claim, social, psychosocial, cultural, but really it's very important. And I think our countries, Baltic countries, is very, very good example how important cultural and social, factors are. If you take a look at suicide rates and fluctuations of suicide rates in Baltic countries, so Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, during last nearly, not 100 years, but during last 80, perhaps years. It's just, I sometimes look at this curves and this epidemiology, like, and I see drama. I read book of history, and it's amazing how all these historical fluctuations coincide with fluctuations of suicide rates. When the second Soviet occupation came, suicide rates in all three Baltic countries increased for many years. So increase was about 8-10 times. Then independence movement came and suddenly dropped in 1 year. 25% drop, it's the right word, drop of suicide rates. And during this period of fighting for independence, of this very, very exciting time, some 5 years suicide rates used to be quite low in comparison to what was before. And after independence, one more cultural trauma came. So this reform time was very, very painful. Professor Sztomko from Poland called it pains of transition. So the change, historical change, was very positive. Everybody was happy about independence, about freedom, about everything. But the process of reformation was very, very difficult. We didn't have resources. So it was one more cultural trauma. Everything collapsed. Old things, old systems collapsed. We had to do from the very beginning to create our states. So, and it costed a lot of lives. Suicide rates increased after independence till 46 per 100,000. Who knows about rates? You can see it's very impressive. 46, and it lasted about 10 years. We were very high on suicide rates. And only afterwards, now suicide rates are decreasing. So I think this example is about importance of psychosocial, cultural factors, cultural traumas, and it raises some interesting questions. For example, if we look at all these East European regions, so as you know, part of it were in Soviet Union, occupied by Soviet Union. Another part was so-called Warsaw Pact, so-called socialist countries like East Europe. And the dynamics of suicide rates was different. And for example, after fall of Berlin Wall, suicide rates in East Germany didn't increase. Not in Czechoslovakia, former Czechoslovakia, only in Baltic countries. And from our experience, we know it was different to live in Poland. Ladies, Marta, Malgosia, to live in Poland was different as to live in Soviet Union, to be Soviet republics. So it's empirical knowledge, but how to compare, how to find which factors, what is different, why suicide rates so high and so increasing here and not so much here? Why after independence our rates increased so dramatically, but not in these countries? It's one thing. Another, and of course we are looking for factors in our society. What is typical? For example, we knew during the Soviet time alcohol consumption as coping mechanism was very, very, how to say, common. And only now in recent research we found not alcohol consumption as such, but motivation, reason behind alcohol does matter. If somebody takes alcohol because of bad mood, because of self-healing, so to say, it becomes a risk factor. Or for example, restrictive emotionality. Is very common in Lithuanian sample, especially in male sample, but we can see it also as historical process, as a result of historical traumas, because we can follow long-term effects of Soviet occupation, and psychology was very, how to say, the society was very controlled. Everybody has to hide their own life, their own emotions, and even in families, we as psychotherapists meet now adult people, adult children of this from Soviet time, and we hear every day in our psychotherapy, restrictive, silent, no share emotions, no express themselves, and so on. So if we look at these things from our perspective, in every country is different, but it's very interesting. It's because I am so thankful to you, colleagues, to Rory, when you raise these broader questions, broader perspectives. It's alive, it's history, it's society, It's the world in which we live, our patients live, and it helps us to understand. And it also shows we have to know our own factors as well. So what is important in Glasgow, in Rory's society, is different in our society, and in Germany is different. And it's very interesting, this interplay of universal and specific factors is just amazing, but practically very, very important to understand and to use in suicide prevention. So it was my thoughts about all these processes we are talking about. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Danuta. And now, last but not least, can we go over to Germany to have Tobias, please?
Okay, thank you. And thank you for your brilliant talk, Rory, and your work and the new book. It's all really great. Let me start with saying that I really like the IMV model as a framework to understand the suicidal process. And from my clinical and my research experience, I would totally agree with the importance of entrapment and mental pain as key drivers of suicidal ideation. Yet I would really love to get to know some more of your thoughts on a slightly different aspect. So I was recently watching a CAMSCare webinar you gave, and within that presentation, you quoted from your own PhD thesis by saying something along the lines, "We cannot predict with much accuracy who will attempt suicide or when." And we all know that this is an unsatisfying yet very true statement, isn't it? And as such, we always have to be aware of the fact that a significant statistically prediction is not the same as clinically relevant or meaningful prediction. And Rosen wrote about that already in 1954 or something. And then Joe Franklin and colleagues, they highlighted this in their famous meta-analysis in 2017. And then Craig Bryan elaborated on this aspect in the just mentioned book, Rethinking Suicide. So bottom line here is, even when we know about statistically significant risk factors and warning signs for suicide, we are no better than chance level, as you just mentioned, in predicting who is going to die by suicide or who is going to attempt suicide. So suicide is a rare event, for God's sake, and we all know from basic courses on statistics that events with a low base rate cannot be predicted with a certainty. And to make things even more complicated, and you mentioned that already, suicide ideation shows a highly fluctuating course, and not all suicidal patients will disclose their suicidal thoughts to us, and the suicidal process does not always develop along a continuum from suicidal thoughts to plans to suicidal behavior. And finally, the transition from decision to die by suicide to suicidal behavior seems to happen rather often within hours or even minutes. And again, all of this makes it really difficult, if not impossible, to accurately identify those persons at highest risk of suicide. And if you take the data serious, they might not even know themselves about their risk at a given moment. And now the IMV model incorporates a large range of risk factors and protective factors, and as such, the complexity inherent to the suicidal process is represented in the model really well. And still, I would doubt that the model would allow a more accurate prediction of suicidal behavior, not because the model is not good, don't get me wrong, but because the task is kind of impossible. So to cut a long story short, here are my questions. First, how do you deal with the problem that accurate prediction was not possible at the time of your PhD thesis, might still not be possible, and presumably will never be, even when using some fancy machine learning algorithms? And how does that affect the scope of applicability of the IMV model? So in essence, I really would like to know all of your thoughts on the importance of theoretical models highlighting specific suicide drivers in a context that is characterized by complexity. So please don't get me wrong. I really don't want to offend you. It's kind of, I'm kind of struggling with these questions myself. So thank you.
If I may interject, I can just say that one approach clinically is to take everyone seriously.
Yeah, right.
So anyone who is thinking about suicide, as clinicians, we think, okay, this person is very much at risk. Let us treat them as if their life is very much in danger. And we could say statistically, it's probably not true, but clinically, we have to take that burden and assume that it is true, which is part of why self-care is so important, because the work is very emotionally draining when we take for granted or we assume that everyone who says that they're thinking about suicide is actually in danger of suicide. But I think we have to take that approach to be safe clinically.
No, I agree with that, Corey. No, they're great questions, Tobias. So for me, it comes down to what's the function of a model, right? And so yeah, obviously we've all written about and written that suicide is no, or prediction is no better than chance. And so the way I see it is the question is it the fallacy of prediction, right? So I don't think we'll ever get to a situation in which we will be able to predict suicide well, it depends which population, but with sufficient sensitivity and specificity that we'll be able to predict an individual death. I don't think that is possible. But no, there have been studies. If you look at, for example, non-suicidal set injury, some of the machine learning models have got decent sensitivity and specificity values of 80%, 90%. But if you look at the samples that they've sampled a high risk group of people who, then the base rate, obviously for the non-suicidal self-injury has increased. Of course, if you increase the base rate, your ability to predict is greater. And actually with Derek de Boer and colleagues, we published a paper a few years ago on this sort of issue of looking at this. And Derek has done a lot of work trying to look at this in the Netherlands. So, but I don't think that's a failure, right? So that's a statistical artifact, as you said, that if you focus on suicide as the outcome, ability to predict will always remain poor. I think we can get better, but it'll still be not optimal. So we are a bit better predicting suicide attempts, and we're probably better still at predicting ideation. And if you speak to Dave Jobs, for example, or Thomas Joyner, they wrote a lovely piece in Crisis a few years ago, trying to say, well, actually, Dave Jobs is really eloquent on this. We have to. Why do we ignore ideation as a treatment target, right? Suicidal ideation, index of distress. We should be targeting that, because if you target the ideation, even though I agree with Craig Bryant and others, that there is a certain percentage of people that perhaps there's no. You could argue, like the impulsive bit, like see in terms of the warning signs, it's more difficult to identify those, and we could argue over the extent to which ideation is present or absent. But I think there'll be some level of ideation even for a short period of time. So I don't have a problem with that. But for me, then the question is, well, what's the function of a model or in that context? And the function of the model, I see the IMV model, is to inform treatment planning, inform care, and then taking up Corey's point. So what you should be doing then is, if we accept our ability to predict is no better than chance, that we should be giving everybody the best possible care if they're expressing suicidal thoughts to protect as many people as possible. And that's why, for example, I really like safety planning, because safety planning it's possible to give that in a much more, I think we should be administered much more public health, in a public health context, so as many people are kept safe as possible. And the other reason, the thing about the models in terms of informing care is, you do then, a model like the IMV, you give treatment targets. So in the way that, and we're developing doing some stuff at the minute and sort of developing a risk formulation sheet based on the IMV model. And so again, it's not about prediction. It's about saying, here's a way of trying to understand your clinical formulation. Here, the sort of say you could be assessing over time the different components of the model and looking at those fluctuations and going, well, actually, I notice that your levels of entrapment have increased. So let's understand what are the drivers to that. So I think if you use it, and that's the way I see it, and I don't think any model you'll ever get to that prediction. And then so the last thing, and then I'll shut up, is it literally has just gone out of my mind. What I was going to say, last thing is just completely gone out of my head. But anyway, so it'll come back to me later.
Come back and interrupt. That's fine. You know, I think we had a question about how do we respond to someone that we conceptualize as using the threat of suicide in order to manipulate other people. In order, you know, if you don't do this, I'll kill myself. It's your responsibility to do the thing I want you to do, whether you're the clinician or a family member or whatever. And obviously, it's a very complex topic. It goes under the category of therapy interfering behaviors in DBT, Linehan's model, but also in everyday life under the category of emotional blackmail. Very dark topic. I'll try to answer that very quickly by saying that first, we take every threat seriously. So if someone appears to be using it as a manipulation, they still may be serious. But I think we have to address the communication. We have to address the fact that they are using the threat of death as social influence. And there are many healthier ways to express your needs than to threaten your own death. And can we work in therapy on how to express your needs in a way that will bring you closer to people in a healthy way, rather than closer to others in a way that is full of desperation and tension and ill will? So it's a matter of changing it into a communication style. That's a very simplistic overview, but I've tried very hard to address the issue with a minimum of shame. And I try not to use the word manipulative because it's a buzzword, but I'll talk about social influence and that there are healthy, mature ways to apply social influence other than the threat of death.
And if I may, sometimes we speak with parents of teenagers or even younger children, and they sometimes are told, it's not serious. Children manipulate, and parents believe it. Right. And then you, as you say, then you have to explain parents. It's very dangerous if the child is going to solve his problems in such way. For development of personality is very, very dangerous. He uses such dangerous ways or methods, and this is what parents are listening to. So it's my experience.
I think I agree with both of those. Tobias, have you anything to add on that question?
To add on this question, I would rather love to come back to the answer you gave before, but maybe I'll just wait till this question is answered on. But I agree with Corey and Danuta that we always have to take this serious, even if it seems as if it's more kind of a suicide gesture that people use to try to manipulate. And maybe we have the time, if the acute crisis is over, to talk about this behavior. But within the acute crisis, I would always take it serious, and always, because what happens, we kind of make people lonely if we tell them, hey, it's not true what you're telling me. And the last thing that we want in this suicidal crisis is to make someone becoming more lonely. And so I would totally agree with your answers. Yeah.
The other thing I suppose, now that you just spoke there, Tobias, is the importance, I think Corey mentioned it earlier, is validation. So validation and understanding why a person is communicating in the way they are. And I often think about the idea of how, if somebody is willing to, even the threat of harming themselves in any way, just imagine the pain they must be experiencing, or that often that they're historically the relationship with maybe adults in their life, and Danuta mentioned young people, may have been in such a way that their attachment relationships are such that the person hasn't been validated, and so they've learned to respond to get their needs met in a way which is not seemingly adaptive. So I think that would be my wider one. Tobias, I know you're keen to go back to the other question, but we can go back to that in a second. I'm just conscious we've got the questions on the chat. I can just cover one here, certainly, and then we can go back to that if you want. So somebody's asked in the chat, how significantly did suicide rates increase during the pandemic? It's really important that we recognize it. So with colleagues across the world, Jane Perkis led this global endeavor, and I was involved in it. I think we covered up to 33 countries, spanning, I think, the first 15 months of the pandemic. And the conclusion was, overall, the suicide rates did not increase. So it's really important to highlight that they did not increase. They did not increase in the United States. They did not increase in the UK. And in most countries in Europe that I'm aware of, there were a couple of exceptions, they did not increase. Now, there were and there are signals of concern. So in Japan, with a young woman, for example, there was evidence that perhaps suicide rates may be increasing. And the concern I have moving forward is we're now in this cost of living crisis, and there is concern. We know from from previous economic recessions and financial instability or uncertainty is associated with suicide risk, and that again will be socially patterned. And then the last thing I'll just say is, because we monitored, in one of the studies we did during COVID, we monitored the mental health and well-being of a representative sample of the UK population, and there was clear evidence of increases in distress, increases in symptoms of depression, anxiety, and suicidal thinking. And that was most marked in at least 4 groups: young people, women, people with pre-existing mental health problems, and once again, those who are socially disadvantaged. So we need to be really, really cautious moving forward that we protect the most vulnerable.
Yeah.
Tobias, or do you want to come in there?
Yeah, maybe I'd like to add something. So in Germany, it was totally the same situation. We had no increase in suicides, at least in 2020 and 2021. We still wait for the official data for 2022. But what I found interesting was that we had an increase in suicide attempts in young girls. And that was not to be seen in 2020. So in 2020, it seemed as if they were fine. But then suddenly in 2021, there was a huge increase in suicide attempts, especially in girls. It was also to be seen in boys, but it was especially pronounced in girls. And so I really think we have to differentiate. It's not okay to kind of talk about the COVID, the pandemic in a global way, but we have to see who suffered at which time the most during the pandemic. And as Rory just said, we really have to a suicide attempt is a bad outcome in itself. Even if it does not lead to suicide, it is a bad outcome in itself. We have to take that serious, I think.
And commenting on the phenomenon of suicidal ideation itself as a target for intervention, even when there is not yet a suicide behavior, a suicide gesture. I emphasize to my patients that just thinking about suicide is itself a priming, a cognitive priming, that makes the distance between where you feel and what you might do shorter and shorter. So even if you've never tried suicide, thoughts bring you closer, and you should focus on those thoughts. And even if you never try, even if you are convinced you will never do anything, you just have the thoughts. Those thoughts require psychological energy. Those thoughts require a certain maintenance, a lot of energy that could be used for personal growth, for interpersonal relationships, for curiosity about what you could learn, is now diverted into this area of just very negative, nihilistic thinking. It's a drain on your life force. So let's focus on the suicidal ideation, even if you never try.
Absolutely. Danuta, do you have anything to add to those last comments?
What, you ask me?
Yeah, just if you of the previous discussion we've just been having on COVID, or have you any?
So we have the same results in within, but in last month, because we have a possibility to get data quite quickly. And war is very, very big stressful situation by us. I know not in all countries is so, but here is very, very stressful thing. And in last some months, suicide rates increase in comparison to previous years. But you know, it's very short time, and we cannot be sure is it tendency or just artifact. So yeah, but yeah. We are curious what is going by us now. So
okay, no, thanks.
Something new, something different, but very short time. We don't know for sure what tendency it is.
Okay, no, that's really helpful, Danuta. So just actually, and then Tobias, maybe if we answer there's a question about South Korea and the cross-cultural question, and then we can maybe go back to, because that'll probably be enough space before we finish at 6:30 my time. So somebody's asked the question, are there any cross-cultural differences? And I think this question was asked before Danuta had given her great opening remarks when you talked about the cross-cultural differences and the specific question. So the short answer is yes, there are huge cross-cultural differences. Lithuania sadly has one of the highest rates of suicide in Europe, and the United Kingdom, we're about, albeit it's terrible talking about sort of league tables, but the United Kingdom, we're about, and the United States are about mid-table in terms of world suicide rates. And the person asked the question about South Korea. Yes, South Korea rates have been increasing. I don't think we know yet why the rates are increasing markedly. And the suggestion the person has put in the chat here was, could it be due to the cultural emphasis on achievement and responsibility? I think that's certainly part of it. But I think it'd be wider than that. And certainly in some of the stuff I've been reading is that I think the healthcare system, in particular for older adults, is maybe not as accessible as it could be. And also, my understanding is that mental health more generally is quite stigmatized still. So I think that could be quite challenging. Are there, in the panel, any other comments on the cultural aspects?
I think it's hard to differentiate, but looking at the United States, I always wonder whether it's mainly access to lethal means that drives the cultural difference, or the higher rates in suicide, or the increase in suicide rates you have in the United States. And that is not really a cultural difference, but it is.
It is.
Yeah, kind of.
It is, unfortunately, yeah.
Unfortunately, it is. It's a cultural difference within the U.S.
Yeah, it's.
Yeah.
I think it's a real challenge in the United States to deal with the access to lethal means. But again, like Mike and Estes are doing great work trying to reframe the argument. So it's not about taking away your rights. It's about trying to increase the distance between you and this incredibly lethal method.
The message I try to send, and admittedly it doesn't work sometimes, it works better other times, but it's not perfect. I say, my opinion is a clinical opinion. It's not a political opinion. Yeah, sure. It's not a what is your constitutional right opinion. Not a legal scholar. This is a clinical opinion, and I offer it as such.
Yeah, that's helpful. And I just see there's just a last couple of quick questions, I think. One is, do we have age differences in suicide? And the answer is yes. Suicide is rare. Pretty universally, suicide is rare before puberty. And then you see this marked increase in suicide risk in those adolescent years from puberty through to your mid-20s. And then it's slight different. I think there are deviations in different countries thereafter where you can see high rates. So for example, in the UK, the highest rate of suicide is currently amongst middle-aged men. But that's slightly different in other countries. Older adults are the highest risk group. But there are those age differences, and it's important to look at age times gender. as well as other sort of intersectionality factors. Anybody want to add anything on the age differences on the panel?
Very interesting in our country. During last 8 years, probably, suicide rates decreased in all age groups here, except the oldest one, 70 plus, didn't change at all. So we have a new problem. What is with our elderly people concerning suicide?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. No, I think it's really important we try and make sense of these different age profiles and the changes of them across country. But interesting, I was just struck by Tobias when we mentioned and Corey, the United States, and we gave the suicide rate for a whole country. In some senses, does that really make any sense, given that the huge variability in a country the size of the United States?
That's right.
And like we would never dream in Europe of just giving the rates of suicide in Europe. So it's always, I always think it's a funny comparison, although I know why we do it. Okay, so Tobias, you just before we finish, we've got about 4 minutes. Tobias, do you want to go back to the issue we were discussing earlier?
Yeah, just maybe quickly, because that was really insightful. Thank you for your answer. And still, sometimes I fear that clinicians will think that it is possible. I mean, not researchers who are deep into the issue, but that sometimes clinicians will think that it is possible to foresee suicidal behavior, or at least to do kind of a risk stratification, if only they ask about all the right questions. Mm-hmm. And as you just said, it's all these questions during a risk exploration might be relevant to treatment planning, but they might not give a clear picture of suicide risk. And I think kind of it's on us to teach it to practicing clinicians. Hey, it's not your fault. I mean, you have to care for all these suicidal patients you see, and you have to be nice to them and compassionate and all of this. But it's not on you to really foresee whether something is happening, and that it might not be the case that you did not ask the right question, because it's more kind of complete picture.
Yeah.
So that's really helpful that you said you said I use these different parts of the model to become treatment relevant information, and that's kind of a strong usage of the model. At least I understand that way.
Yeah, no, that's exactly it. Well, but the other thing is, 2 things came into my mind, is that even if you could predict with sufficient sensitivity and specificity, that doesn't help you on an individual case basis.
Yes.
That's right.
So that's why I think it's a fallacy of prediction. In the United Kingdom, I was involved in, there's a group over the last wee while, and we published the National Institute of Health and Care Excellence guidance on the management of self-harm. And remember, that includes all forms of suicidal behavior. But again, we published the most recent guidance last year, but these are an updated guidance from 2011. But we've made it very, very clear that risk stratification does not work.
Yeah.
But you're right. I think it's a whole culture change. And so what we're trying to promote in those guidance is this risk formulation approach, which is about, at the heart, it's person-centered, and trying to say, actually, we're trying to give the person the best treatment to understand what is going on in their life to increase their risk and do whatever we can to mitigate that risk. But we accept that there's this fallacy of prediction. You cannot predict on an individual level, and we should not be using high, medium, and low risk to withhold care. We're very, very clear on that in the guidance. But we've been saying it. But we've been saying it since 2011. So your point is still true, Tobias.
Yeah.
It's getting it from the guidance to a system, and the system is risk averse and thinking if you do these risk assessments, that you'll be able to predict all the suicides, and it really is a challenge.
Yeah.
But I liked how you described it as well, Tobias, about you still in the context of the frontline clinician, it's not about you're not caring. You still care for every patient, but it's that the blame the system and then the blame and again, we published a review recently in the last couple of years on the impact of losing a patient to suicide on clinicians, and it's devastating.
Yeah.
So in the last couple of minutes, then, just before we finish, Corey, Tobias, and then Danuta, a couple of final comments. So Corey, if I go to you first,
Sure.
then Danuta, and then Tobias.
Let's make sure that when we assess, as clinicians, when we assess for suicide, that we always ask the person, why? Why do you want to die? Because I've heard patients say, I went to the ER and I was asked, what did I take? What chemical did I take? How much did I take? When did I take it? Who knows about it? Whose prescription is this? But nobody asked me why. Why do I want to die? And that's the most important question to really understand their phenomenology and to bond and to be able to give maximum compassion.
Brilliant advice. Brilliant advice. Danuta. Oh, it's Danuta.
Thank you. Thank you. Do you hear me?
Yes, we hear you. Yep.
So I just want to repeat, it's so good to have this broader perspective. And even clinical and research perspective and broad view. So I think it's very, very important because we are professionals. We are organizing not only support for patients, but also politics of health systems, and it depends very much on us. How do we see the problem? So it's for me very, very important not to be only, I don't know, biological, but yeah, this broader view and different perspectives are very important to me. Thank you.
Thanks, thank you very much. And the last word, Tobias, to you, then we'll hand back to Marta.
Okay, so I would add on Corey's statement, and I would say always ask the person, what do you need to feel safe, and how can I help you with becoming more safe? So make it kind of a collaborative project and not a project where you kind of be the clinician, the expert, telling the patient what to do, but do it together with the patient.
Brilliant. I love the succinctness of those. Hand back to Marta.
Very much. I think it's very enriching that in the webinar we've heard about research and tons of it, but also what's I'm guessing must be hugely helpful for any therapist listening to us, that you also gave an advice from a therapist point of view. And I think I hope I will be forgiven for just summing up that from a research point of view, suicide may be fascinating and why it happens, but it's a public health issue. And when I see anything that is published in BMJ, then I know it's getting, this is getting sort of attention of the public health domain. So thank you very much for dedicating your time here to be here for free. It's evening, well, not for Corey, but for us it's evening. What you said is valuable. We record that, so we will distribute, so everyone can watch it over and over again. We are preparing for a next webinar on providing help to refugees across Europe. So watch the space. And in the meantime, thank you very much. And obviously, thank you to audience for listening to us, bearing with us, and for your amazing questions. Good night.
Good night.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.